This video is part of a webinar series on Hindudvesha, an educational series to explore and expose systemic Hindu phobia.
First, I want to thank Jai Bansal and the American Hindus Against Defamation and the World Hindu Council and Dharma Civilization for holding this series and for inviting me. I am extremely honored to be part of this. The first slide is not what you typically see in an academic presentation or webinar. Because in that slide, that's my family. On the left is my father holding me when I was born, and my mother in a picture just below him. One minute, I'm so sorry. And that is in a displaced persons camp in Landsberg, Germany. That's where I was born, and that's where Hitler wrote his book, Mein Kampf, which was dedicated to the fact that no Jewish children would be born. The rest of the pictures, and there aren't many, are the ones my parents managed to hide while in concentration camp, risking their lives hiding pictures because Jews were not supposed to have pictures of other family members, including my grandfather, my grandmother, 2 uncles. They were among 182 members of my family that were killed in the Holocaust. So this subject is very personal for me. And when I was growing up, my parents and all survivors had a phrase, never again. You believed that never again would the world allow this kind of evil to rise up. Never again. And I believed it until recently. And I see that anti-Semitism is like a virus. It's irrational. It's embedded within DNA. We think it's eradicated. It mutates. It's not a static disease, but it adapts to the environmental circumstances. It invades neighboring organs. It causes metastasis. And because of all these adaptations of anti-Semitism for 2,000 years, it's sometimes difficult to identify. So I'm going to take you on a short journey of what historian Richard Wistrich calls the longest hatred. Next slide, please. First, anti-Semitism about 2,000 years ago, and that is with the early church. The early church had a problem with Jewish people existing in the world because what were we doing here if we didn't accept, and we had our way of believing, our covenant with God. It was an affront to the Christian covenant with God. And we're a terrible annoyance. And they developed themes then that have existed from early Christianity till today, that Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ, omitting the fact that he was a Jew. And so that if Jews were so evil that they killed God, then they deserved every punishment they received. And so in the next slide, we see one of the common themes, and that is the demonic blood libel. That there was a myth that Jews used the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes. In fact, Judaism prohibits us very strictly from consuming any kind of blood whatsoever. But this idea took hold, and it led to inquisitions, expulsions, discrimination against Jews. At that point, It was religious. So the cause was religious, but the cure was also religion. Jews could convert to Christianity. It was a ticket to prosperity. Most refused, some did. And so at that point, when they were no longer Jews, the anti-Semites perhaps could be appeased. We move forward in history to the Enlightenment. Next slide. Now here's a time, the Enlightenment, where everything should have been so much better. We had secular humanism at the end of the 18th century, ideas that we're going to believe in science over religion, nationalism over feudal states. And we saw here a growth in nationalism, people who shared a language, culture, values, history, they could come together. But then what do you do with the Jews? A nation within a nation. And so there started another anti-Semitic trope. It actually started early in history, but it was picked up then, that Jews are not loyal, that they have dual loyalty, more loyalty to their nation than to the land in which they live, despite all the assimilation and contributions. Also in the next slide, we see Darwinism. He wrote The Origin of the Species, Natural Selection, Survival of the Fittest. But this new confidence in science unleashed an anti-Semitism not based on religion, but it was racial, genetic anti-Semitism. They misapplied Darwinism to Darwin's theory of natural selection to social Darwinism, thinking some human beings were superior to others. And it's with these social Darwinist theories that were the underpinning of Adolf Hitler and Nazi ideology. And the Nazi message of racial inferiority was in their art, music, theater, books, radio, educational things. You'll see here a picture. It's an image in 1938, and it compares German youth with Jewish youth. And it says, from the face speaks the soul of the race. Now, once it's racial, there's nothing you can do about it. You're stuck with it. You can't change. You're condemned as an inferior race. The next slide. And when it's racial, it's not that only the Jews were seen as lesser human beings, but they were dehumanized. They were made into represented by snakes and spiders and all kinds of low creatures. And here is where there's a strange intersection of Hinduism and what happened to the Jewish experience. The anti-Semites, the racist anti-Semites, came up with the idea of the non-Aryans. They took this, which had a completely different meaning in the Hindu religion, and they portrayed the Jews as non-Aryan, lesser biological beings. They imagined this race that migrated to India and struggled to maintain its purity, its racial theory. And that's later on comes into play with how some people are describing the caste system. Now, in addition to religious and racial, the next slide will tell us economic. In the middle of the 19th century, Russian anti-Semitism began to focus on the economic impact of Jews. It's casting them as representatives of the capitalist system at a time when socialism was beginning to take hold in Russia. Of course, in other places, Jews were blamed for being communists and capitalists at the same time. And then in Europe, between World War I and II, there was a terrible depression. Someone had to be blamed. And so it was a common that the Jews control the economy, the media, and all aspects of the world. How do they do this? Next slide. conspiracy, a mass conspiracy theory. 1903, they published a forged minutes of a meeting that never happened, a supposedly secretive Jewish cabal with Jews bent on destruction of the world and domination. This book was called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It is absolute ridiculous nonsense. However, it spread and is still spreading and consuming the world. We have it in almost every language. And this conspiracy theory is so great that if you look at the Middle Eastern press, a few years ago, there were shark attacks in Egypt. And in a normal newspaper, non-extreme newspaper, they said that the sharks were trained by the Israelis to attack only Muslims. That's how crazy conspiracy theories can get. Also, Iran arrested a squirrel for being an Israeli Mossad agent. So we have these various themes of anti-Semitism. And the next slide shows us what happens when propaganda meets opportunity. The results of this religious, economic, racial anti-Semitism led to a massacre of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and at least 5 million other people. And it was a catastrophe so big that I think for a short time it stunned the world. And no one in polite society would be proudly anti-Semitic. And then, although the Jews in the Middle East, although Jews and Christians throughout the Islamic world were often denied their rights and they faced persecution, European anti-Semitism jumped continents in World War II and infiltrated the Mideast. The Grand Mufti of Palestine was a close friend and tie of Hitler. Nazi Germany developed ties with Egypt and other newly created Arab nations. And after the wars, after the World War II, when the Nazis had to run, many ran to the Middle East. And where they brought their media campaigns and anti-Semitic messaging. And so you'll see in Arabic images that are almost identical to what you've seen in the German press. We're jumping ahead, 1967, Six-Day War. Russia, or the USSR at that time, wanted to increase their control of the region in the Middle East, so they provoked a war. They thought Israel would be crushed, and it wasn't really a war only of Israel and its neighbors. It was a proxy war in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. The spectacular success of the Israel strike in 1967 put an end to Soviet plans in 6 short days. Their tanks and their weapons were abandoned in the field. Little Israel destroyed multiple Arab armies that had been supplied and trained by the Soviets. It was a big score for the US. But the Soviets were determined to inflict another form of punishment on the Israelis who had humiliated them in the battlefield. And they started the most aggressive campaign of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, disinformation across not only the USSR, but they're selling 1 million copy circulations in 80 foreign languages, carrying across the West. Developing nations, radio broadcasts. They were on for 1,000 hours of Soviet propaganda weekly to every continent on the planet. And the next slide shows the results of this propaganda. The UN had a meeting on Zionism, and they falsely equated it with racism, Nazism, fascism, genocide, settler colonialism, imperialism, all the things that developing nations don't like, they put on Israel. The next slide. It wasn't so long after World War II, so the Soviets had a little bit of a problem with the Holocaust because they fought the Nazis. So they started a campaign of Holocaust denial, dismissal, and distortion, because they said, no, we're not anti-Semitic. Anytime somebody would say that their propaganda was, they say, oh, these are Zionist tricks or nefarious imperialist schemings. But even there's a publication here by Mahmoud Abbas, head of the Palestinian Authority, in which he accepted this Soviet propaganda and had conflicting lies in the same book. The Holocaust was exaggerated. It was perpetrated by Jews. It wasn't so bad. And it's the Jews who are inflicting it on others. So there was the Holocaust distortion. In the next slide, a new form of anti-Semitic attack, apartheid. This has been added. The false analogy between racist apartheid, South Africa, and democratic Israel. I went to South Africa when it was under apartheid, and it was an abomination to humankind to see the social system that they had there, with benches that were Nia Blanca, Neta Blanca, water fountains, Nia Blanca, Neta Blanca, only for whites, not for whites. A system in which every Black person had to carry a special identity card. But this image was now put on Israel, which is a diverse country, which has had representation of all different ethnic groups in its legal and judicial and legislative system. And on US campuses across the country, usually around March, we have a series of Israel Apartheid Week, lectures, exhibits, events, and it demonizes Israel to the most innocent, uninformed eyes, and that's what students leave thinking. The next slide. And so we see racism coming back, but now it's a little different. My mother of blessed memory passed away 2 years ago, and right before her death, she had the television on, and she heard one of these women referring to Jews as white supremacists. And she said, my entire family was murdered because we're not white, and now I'm white. But it's calling Jews white supremacists. It strips us of our diversity. It takes away the fact that there are Jews from Yemen, Morocco, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Ethiopia, and India, and many other places. It wants to bleach away our diversity so there's no history of the Jewish people. And the next slide, all this brings an incitement to violence. And we see more and more insightful language directed at Israel and directed at Jews. The next slide. The outcome of this is dangerous. In 2019, Jews are under 2% of all Americans. In an FBI report in 2019, over 60% of all religiously motivated crimes are directed against Jews, but it's worse in France and Germany and Europe. But in 2020, anti-Semitism increased by about 50%. And 70% of Jews now say they have experienced anti-Semitism. The next slide, please. And one of the problems is in the media now, it's not an embarrassment as in the past, but you see superheroes, sports heroes, rock stars, hip hop, where it's cool to be anti-Jew. And the next slide. And we see anti-Semitism not just being the extreme radical elements of society, but mainstreaming. Louis Farrakhan, pictured here, is the epitome. He's the poster child of anti-Semitism today. What he has said against Jews, he calls Jews vermin. He doesn't say, he says, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm an anti-termite. He praises Hitler, says he was a great man. He says Jews are controlling the world. He blames Jews and Israel for 9/11. And yet he is shown here with prestigious people, and they lend credibility when they take a picture with him to his anti-Semitism. The next slide. And so we see now that there is where the church challenged the right of Jews to be Jewish. Nazis said the individual doesn't have the right to live. The Soviets said Israel has no right to exist. And now the direction they say, we're not anti-Semitic. But when you say from the river to the sea, which is a common chant against Israel, that's every piece of territory. And it means death. It's a call for death to the Jewish state. And it's 7 million Jewish inhabitants. Next slide, please. And this happens by something called intersectionality, alliances with grievance groups, saying all injustices are interconnected. If it's racial, ethnic, sexual, gender, class, they're all overlapping, and all the oppressed groups need to join into common interests. Solidarity is essential. You must express your solidarity even if you don't believe it, especially on campus. And you'll see on a demonstration, whether it's in Ferguson, where Michael Brown was killed by a policeman who had never been to Israel, the signs of the people marching were against Israel. In women's marches, in gay activism, Israel is the only place in the Middle East where it's safe to be gay, but yet in all of those movements, there are attacks on Israel. Intersectionality. So it's kind of like the oppression Olympics, but Jews can't play. Our history of suffering is downplayed. And it's very clever. Slide 21. It's hate, but it's hidden in beautiful human rights language. So they've taken the anti-Soviet propaganda and they say, we're against discrimination, we're against racism, we're against colonialism, misogyny, war crimes. And all of that is lodged against the only viable democracy in the Middle East. And they call themselves Students for Justice in Palestine, and even, I'm ashamed to say, Jewish Voice for Peace. And their solutions to the complex issues in the Middle East would be very agreeable to the Nazis. It's their genocidal solutions. So you might ask, slide 22, why don't you say anything? Because there's a concerted effort to prevent the pro-Israel point of view. Its First Amendment is for me, not for thee. So these groups are bullying and harassing Jewish and pro-Israel students. I've seen this happen now against some Hindu students as well. And then they cry that their rights are denied. Groups are routinely pressuring school administrations to prevent pro-Israel speakers from visiting campuses. They're canceling speakers that have been invited. They're shouting down speakers who are trying to speak. In DePaul University in Chicago, students successfully lobbied for the school to fire a pro-Israel professor because he challenged the Students for Justice for Palestine narrative. Last year, a friend of mine at the same university, he's Black, gay, and an immigrant, criticized the Palestinian Authority for corruption. There was such an outrage that he had to be escorted to and from his classes by the police. And his fellow academics didn't stand with him, didn't support him. In fact, they censored him for upsetting the feelings of the anti-Israel students. So it's number 23, the next slide, you'll see that it's not about facts. It's about emotion, theater, mock checkpoints, intimidation, reenactment of IDF soldiers beating up. So it's a very theatrical, emotional production. The next slide, please. And here we have the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction, BDS campaign. This is where anti-Semitism has found its loudest microphone. It's a call to punish Israel, make it a pariah state. By weakening Israel, isolating Israel, it will be easier to destroy. And it doesn't matter if in that process they hurt Palestinians and the Palestinians lose the job. Destroying Israel is more important than helping Palestinians. And don't believe me, look at their BDS founders in their own words in the next slide. Omar Barghouti, I don't know if it's large enough for you to read. We oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine, which means every single inch. The current phase has all the emblematic properties of what we considered the final chapter of the Zionist project. We are witnessing the rapid demise of Zionism, and nothing could be done to save it, for Zionism is intent in killing itself, and I, for one, support euthanasia. Assad Abu Khalil, justice and freedom for Palestinians are incompatible with the existence of Israel. Ahmed Moore, okay, fine. So BDS does mean the end of the Jewish state. It's not another step to the final showdown. BDS is the final showdown. The next slide shows you some of the areas you find this boycott divestment in culture. It's trying to stop musicians. It's one of the biggest champions is Roger Waters, co-founder of Pink Floyd. Anytime an artist wants to go to Israel, Roger Waters puts enormous pressure on the artist not to go. Thank goodness most of them don't listen to him. On top, when he has concerts floating on top of the concerts, he has these inflatable pigs. And they have a Star of David, which is the symbol of the Israeli flag floating above his concerts. In the next slide, we see that the arena is also in economic. I'm sure this week you heard about Ben and Jerry's saying that it's not going to sell its ice cream in the occupied territories, but that's even false because the occupied territories includes East Jerusalem. And they were going to ask an Israeli vendor to do a secondary boycott and not sell in other areas of Israel, which is against the law. They knew that by putting out that statement, that they are in fact boycotting one country and one country only, and that's Israel. And we see academic institutions, organizations, facts don't matter either. They are issuing resolutions against Israel. Now, something that concerns us all is the new ethnic studies programs. There are committees, they started in California, but now they're all over the country, and they're revisiting social studies curricula, which is great. I think it's wonderful for students to learn about the different ethnic groups that make up this country, except if you look at the model curriculum, only some people get to qualify as ethnic minorities. Jews don't, even if they're Ethiopian Jews. Hindus from India don't. And so there are large components of discrimination in these curricula, and they have to be very carefully monitored. So by this time, I hope I haven't made you all very unhappy and depressed, because my final slide gives us some hope. There are answers. Unity and clarity. When we are doing what we're doing right now, understanding that our similarities far outweigh our differences, when we understand that hate against Jews and hate against Hindus depends on the darkness of ignorance, together we can shine a light and educate people. We have worked together over the past few years. just a few months ago, the Chicago City Council, and I'm not quite sure why, took up a very anti-Hindu Indian ordinance on the CAA, the citizenship law. It was wrong. It had no place in the Chicago City Council, where they can't afford to pay the electric bill. And we worked together to defeat it. We worked together to get California to make some positive changes in their ethnic studies. We have worked together on a number of different fronts, and that unity is extremely important. And the next thing is clarity. I see that you are putting up a site to address, and I may be saying this wrong, Hindudvesha, to address it, because Hindudvesha, because you want people to be clear. Because anti-Semitism so changes and morphs over time, we need to have a clear definition, and that one exists. It is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. It has 11 examples. It provides people with guidance so they know what anti-Semitism is when they see it. It was developed by some of the world's greatest scholars on the subject area. It doesn't tell you you can't be anti-Semitic. You can. You can stand on the rooftop and shout out anti-Semitic things, but it makes it clear that I and you have the right to call it out for what it is. And so we have a clear definition so people can't hide and camouflage their anti-Semitism behind other veneers. And so far, 35 democracies have adopted it. It has been on the State Department website for about 10 years. It has been adopted by hundreds of institutions, including the largest imams organization in the world. And so we're asking that all our friends, someplace on your website or on your Facebook page or anywhere, that our friends say we adopt the IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, so that together we're clear. And despite our challenges, and there are lots, I feel strongly that if the Hindu American and Jewish American communities are united and clear, we will prevail.